Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are tuning in to
Recording
and
in progress.
today. I am Alvic Padilla and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. I am from the Debt Justice Program of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. And on behalf of our coordinator at IPMDD, Lidi Nakpil, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar entitled IMF World Bank, 8 Decades of Debt and Destruction in Asia. So today we delve into the profound impact of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank on the Global South, with particular emphasis or focus in our region in Asia. For 8 decades, these Bretton Woods institutions, which have been controlled by wealthy nations, have pushed loans and introduced market-based and private sector financing and development strategies as the primary solution to social, economic, and environmental crises throughout many years and many decades. However, these have proven to be false solutions because they have only embedded a cycle of unsustainable debts and dependency. Moreover, the imposition of structural adjustment and austerity measures, though often denied, remains a harsh reality to this day. These policies disproportionately affect the most vulnerable, especially women and girls. Today, we are joined by an esteemed panel of speakers and reactors, and we are happy with that all of them have accepted our invitation to share their reflections and be part of this webinar. Our panel of speakers and reactors are activists, policy experts, scholars, human rights defenders, climate advocates, mass leaders, and campaigners for many years, some for decades, in the social justice and economic justice movements, not only in our region across Asia, but also globally. This afternoon, they will share their reflections and unpack how these two institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, have wielded their power and influence, perpetuating a deeply unequal, unjust, and profit-driven global order. Thank you in advance for our speakers for joining us in exploring these critical issues and advocate for a more just and equitable world. Now, so we can now get started. We have, as I mentioned, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 speakers lined up. So we can start the ball rolling by calling on our first speaker, the Executive Director of Third World Network, Chi Yok Ling.
Thank you very much, Alvic, and greetings to all our friends from Asia and outside of Asia. I see we have a very diverse turnout. Thank you, APMD, for convening this discussion. I think for us in the Asian region, as in all the southern regions, we've gone through these 8 decades of a lot of experience and impacts. And as we all know, having been part of this work from different angles over the years, young and old and experienced and newcomers in the world of activism and thinking and research, the fundamental problem really is that the systemic ideology of neoliberalism, of the market being more efficient, of deregulation, these elements of a structural flawed system in macroeconomics continue to drive policies. And what we see really is the more we expose, and we have had movements across Asia, across Africa, across Latin America, which had exposed, especially through the austerity measures of IMF conditionalities and the kind of financial instability that all our countries have gone through in different ways because of our exposure to the global financial system that is inherently, in fact, designed to be unequal, deeply unequal, with the dominance of the G7 and even within the G7, the smaller group, And increasingly, with the wealth transfer to more and more private actors, the international financial architecture and governance is extremely unequal, more so than we've ever seen in the last 8 decades. So this combination of a further entrenchment of that ideology and the governance that comes with it has actually removed tremendous policy space for the national development choices and pathways. And while we have exposed austerity measures, for example, and their impact, even countries that today, like Indonesia, learned from the financial crisis that it will not want to go back to the IMF if it can avoid it, and it has done so, has internalized those notions of liberalization, even without conditionalities. A country like Malaysia that never had to be at the mercy of the IMF, and we actually survived the Asian financial crisis because we went against mainstream, as you all recall, by using capital controls. Not such a revolutionary thing. It's a very sensible financial stability measure to take. And yet we were so vilified when our government did that back in the 1990s. Of course, reluctantly now it is recognized that capital controls are necessary, are a tool, and should be used. And I'll come back to that later because I think capital controls is really one of the advocacy demands that we as civil society need to really put up front as one of our priorities today, moving into the future. So I would say that even for Malaysia, we don't have the history of IMF loan conditionalities on austerity, but we have also internalized it. So you have this sense that government should be spending less and we should be privatizing or corporatizing, and I think those are heavily internalized. If you see for Indonesia, for example, the recent announcement by the new president that he's going to have a 10-year free lunch program, and this will involve trillions of government spending, of rupiah. And this will actually, and when this announcement was made recently, we saw how the markets reacted. Money started leaving Indonesia because the government announced it's going to do big spending. So I think that for us, the mission creep in the IMF and the World Bank in terms of how suddenly they're at the forefront of climate financing. We do not want, climate finance. We do not see climate justice or gender justice or macroeconomic justice emanating from those two institutions. And yet they have a lot of mission creep supported by the OECD countries. We see how, and we have to be very careful, and I want to sort of end on this note, that in the UN, the Summit of the Future is where one of the key areas identified for discussion is international financial architecture. And yet we see that it is not just the North. We have also finance ministries, central banks from the South who do not want to see the UN have a bigger role in oversight over financial institutions and global governance in finance. So we need to do a lot of work at the national level as civil society to continue popularizing the issues of financial stability, the fundamental causes of debt, the role of private creditors, and how the market is really holding and paying polluters and human rights violators, rewarding them and punishing those whose rights should be protected. So we need to do that because we have, like I said, internalized at the governance level within our own countries in Asia, a lot of the neoliberal deregulating philosophy. So I'll stop there and we can have discussion following. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And we will still have our speakers will be on standby. We will be with us, and she can Ling can reply to any questions and further discussions later on. So now let's jump into our next speaker is going to share his reflections on the 8 decades of IMF and World Bank in our region across Asia. He's the executive director of the Center for Financial Accountability to share reflections from India and South Asia context and perspective. May I give the floor to Joe Atiali. Joe?
Thank you, Alvik. Thank you, Alvik, and thank you, IPMDD, for giving this opportunity. I congratulate all of you because of organizing this webinar. These conversations need to happen again and again. It's very apt that on the 80th year, we are remembering ourselves and reminding the World Bank what kind of footprint that they have left behind in the past 8 decades. We need to tell the story again and again. I mean, it's really amazing that a lot of activist friends are here around. Some of them have worked for decades on these institutions. But we need to kind of tell the story again and again that this institution fundamentally is undemocratic. This institution has pushed corporate welfare at the cost of social protection measures in most of the countries, I mean, if not all. This country has kind of pushed privatization in a massive way, inviting corporations to come and loot the natural resources. I mean, all of this, I mean, we very well know that has resulted into having huge impact on our economies. I mean, in the name of ease of doing business, which is now kind of suspended, how they have influenced countries like India to kind of water down labor standards, environmental protection, and regulatory kind of laws in the country, making it easy for the corporations to kind of come and plunder the natural resources and exploit human resources in the country. They have also kind of become the standard setter, the knowledge bank, and all those kind of things. Whatever the bank is now claiming about having progressive policies and mechanisms and all those kind of things didn't come as a charity from the bank. It came as a product of long people's struggles over the decades from all over the global south. I mean, whether it's inspection panel, whether it's the safeguard policies, all of them that they are claiming to be kind of progressive measures there, policies there, is a result of the protests. There's a lot of conversations happening about World Bank reforms, right? I mean, can the bank be reformed? How can an undemocratic institution be reformed? Into what? I mean, will they kind of give up power? I mean, if they give up power, I mean, the institution loses its, I mean, model which they have been kind of promoting over the past 8 decades. What they may at best do is to kind of give some concession here and there and continue the kind of business there. So we need to kind of ask as campaigners fundamental changes at the bank and not some ornamental reforms that they are kind of talking about. We need to step up challenging the bank at each and every project, policy, and whenever and wherever it is possible to make sure that the people and the environment are not undermined and they are not negatively impacted by the investments that they are kind of doing. It's only a strong people's movement from the global south and particularly from Asia where they are investing that the bank can be kind of challenged and that bank can be kind of made accountable. I mean, this is not just that people in the global south. We certainly know that we have friends in the global north who agree with us and who support us. So it's a job. I mean, it's a struggle struggle of all of us together in solidarity with each other that we can kind of challenge these institutions. Thank you, Alvik. I will stay for the questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. I'm sure there's still a lot to unpack there later in our open forum. But next, may I introduce our next speaker to share reflections. She's the regional coordinator of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law, and Development. And it would be interesting to hear her thoughts on the IMF, World Bank, and the Asia experience as it relates to impact on women and girls in our region. May I give the floor to Miss-on Wu.
Thank you very much, Alvik, and hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay, because I think the internet connectivity from my end is a bit unstable. But yeah, thank you really for APMDD for this opportunity to engage in this important conversation. APWD, we are a feminist membership-driven network with over 310 members coming from 31 different countries and territories across Asia and the Pacific region. And we believe in the power of feminist movements and people's solidarity and are committed to really dismantling the systems of oppressions that actually undermines women's human rights and development justice. As Yokling and Joe mentioned, let me just build on from what they have already shared with us. And since its establishment in 1944, its 80th anniversary, I cannot believe that they are allowed to celebrate it, but they have been facilitating the deliberate global financial crisis, war and conflicts at least once in every decade, right? And the IMF and World Bank have only consolidated colonialism and imperialism through the so-called structural adjustment program since 1979.
Miss Sol, we can't hear.
Independence or freedom from those colonial powers, and to talk about the destructive consequences of the IMF and World Bank on women, I am more than outraged, as it clearly shows how the collaboration of colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy orchestrate systemically to subjugate, enslave, and violate women, and cement the inequalities of power, wealth, and opportunities between men and women, between rich and poor, and between countries. I will share some stories of women that describe how national laws and policies forced by the IMF and World Bank not only change, but rather destroy their lives and livelihood. And I'll invite you to actually make a guess from which countries these stories are coming from. So the first country is that the previously universal state nutrition allowance, which was provided in the form of redeemable food voucher, is stopped under the net rationale to exclude rich people from obtaining these vouchers, and then for that resources to go to the people who really need. It has set people with less than $150 per month only as a targeted recipient group to respond to the national budget deficit. It not only has potential, but actually already has detrimental effects on women, particularly those pregnant, as the previous support, which was universal, was largely going to pregnant women and lactating mothers to meet their nutritional needs. The second story is about that almost 90% of social service jobs, such as public health sector workers, nurses or nurse assistants, care workers in care facilities, including childcare and aged care, and social workers are held by women. Among these jobs, especially engaged in care and health services, their median monthly wage is 42.5% lower than the overall median monthly wage of the social service industry. And mostly women are on temporary work employment with least labor protection. And women spend 3 times at least more than men on unpaid care of children or elderly people. Another story is approximately 70% of women work in the informal economy, while women are first to have lost jobs if engaged in the formal economy. And we have data actually that over 50% were laid off in the workplace. They struggle to meet the basic household needs due to over almost 300% increase in fuel prices following the privatization of the energy sector and inflation of basic needs such as food. And women engage in multiple jobs to generate more income while most often cutting their need for food intake and medications, significantly affecting their health. The last story I want to share is about the significant tariff reduction, deregulation of import controls, and tax incentives for foreign investors. On the other hand, the increased VAT rate and taxes on junk food and sweets are disproportionately affecting low-income individuals because they spend a larger portion of their income on basic consumption, while junk food, sadly, such as cup noodles, are mostly only affordable food choices for those people in need. And furthermore, the debt payment allocation was much higher compared to the budget allocated for food, social security, welfare, employment, or housing, or even agriculture. Yeah. So these stories recently are shared by APWLD members and partners just a couple of weeks ago, and the countries range from Pakistan, Philippines, Sri Lanka, and even South Korea. The bad news is that all these stories are not unique or isolated realities, but commonly shared by women across the countries in Asia and the Pacific region. And there are uncountable stories shared commonly across generations. So those poverty, debt threat, neoliberal society, not only economy, but politically, also at society at large, are passed on by generations. And we're talking about a very long-term effect on today. And it confirms that there is a debt formula, which is a clear manifestation of neocolonialism and imperialism that takes away people's life, dignity, and sovereign power. Another common reality that was shared for women that really requires urgent attention is the increase in private or household debt. Women borrow money from multiple sources just to make both ends meet. And those are coming with often at the very higher rates from private lending companies and loan sharks due to systemic barriers for women to access formal lending institutions. And private household debt occurs as the consequences of fundamental restructuring of our nation's political, economic, and social policies to align IMF and World Bank conditionalities and to secure credibility for foreign investment. And we all know very well these rules, including aggressive privatization of social services and state-owned public sector enterprises, labor flexibilization, liberalization of trade and finance, and regressive taxation policy. And actually, our countries and peoples have been on the market for wholesale. The IMF and World Bank both have the so-called gender strategy for gender mainstreaming and gender equality. However, it primarily aims to more women in the current put more women in the current unjust market system, squeeze women's labor, both productive and reproductive labor, for profits, promotes women's entrepreneurship in the name of women's economic empowerment, and instrumentalize human rights perspective to maximize human capital development. So human are not human being, it's the economic value set for capital development. The reform of international financial institution, as Joe mentioned, is a popular agenda, especially in the context of the upcoming 4th International Conference. But I would really like to problematize this approach. The realities of women in Asia and the Pacific confirms that there cannot be any reform to this system and structures, but only to dismantle them. We need no less than the people's sovereignty to determine our own development path, with women's right to self-determination starting from. We demand, as APWLD, immediate cancellation of all debt and those freed up resources to be redirected to fulfill state human rights obligations, especially for women and other historically and structurally marginalized communities. It is really time to call out the criminal activities of the IMF and World Bank and those of Global North lender countries and guarantee reparations for accountability and justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Soon, for that very comprehensive sharing and reflection. Again, I'd like to remind everyone we will have an open forum later on. But even while our speakers are sharing their reflections, please feel free to use the chat box to already share your thoughts and ideas and questions to our speakers. And we can come back to that, to those questions later on at the open forum. So I would like now to introduce our next speaker. He wears many hats, a scholar and an activist, Professor Emeritus at the University of the Philippines. He's also now the convener of the program on alternative development of the Center for Integrative Development Studies of the University of the Philippines. May I introduce Dr. Eduardo Tadem.
Thank you, Alvic. And I'm honored to be one of the speakers in this very important forum on 8 decades of death and destruction led by the World Bank IMF. I would like to share a presentation, if I may.
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay, so I have a rather short presentation for such a big topic that has been assigned to me, or which I intended to present. I will first look just generally at the debt situation of Southeast Asia, with particular emphasis on the Philippines, and then move on to what I would call the quote-unquote hidden costs of government borrowing, and then lastly, saying something about this whole notion about domestic debts now overtaking the foreign borrowings. So, developing economies, to which most Southeast Asia belongs, faces a funding gap of almost 500 billion US dollars in collective debt reserving payments that will be due in the next 4 years, or actually other 3 years, since this estimate was made by the World Economic Forum last year. The debt to GDP ratio of Southeast Asia grew from 49% in 2019, as you can see from the table on the right, to 60% in 2023, with Singapore, Laos, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines, as well as Myanmar, going beyond the threshold of 40% of which is recommended as the debt sustainability for developing and emergent economies. So let's take a quick look at that table on the right. It says 6 countries have already gone beyond the threshold, with Indonesia almost at the threshold. Particular concern is China's growing exposure in Southeast Asia's development financing policies. A study by Singapore's Institute for Southeast Asian Studies reports that since China's development loans in the region are commercially driven and mainly debt financed rather than aid financed, interest rates are substantially higher than those of benchmark institutions such as the World Bank, and therefore generate higher returns for Chinese lenders. One particular case stands out: the 1,035-kilometer Lao-China Railway, which connects Yunnan province in China and Vientiane in Laos. It was inaugurated in December 2021 with a total project cost of $6 billion US dollars, of which China covered 70%, or 4.2 billion, aside from providing technology, equipment, and operational expertise. Now, the remaining 1.8 billion was charged to Laos as loans, which is equivalent to 10% of Laos' GDP. The benefits for Laos from the project, however, will take 22 years to recoup in a worst-case scenario and 3 years as a best case. The former, 22 years, seems more likely given Laos' foreign debt of 14.5 billion US dollars at the end of 2021 and a weakening currency. Laos' total debts to China already comprise 65% of its GDP, and it is considered the highest in the world between 2 countries, and raises concerns about a debt trap that would leave Laos saddled with loans which it may not be able to repay. Okay. The cost of government borrowings is usually reported as the debt service in terms of combination of interest and principal payments. For the Philippines, the total debt service amounted to approximately 27 billion US dollars, broken down into interest payments of $10.7 billion and principal payments of 16.5 billion out of the 249.3 billion Philippine government debt as of the end of 2023. Now, this comprised a hefty 30% of the 2023 Philippine government budget of 898 billion US dollars. Now, these amounts are already staggering enough. However, these are not the only costs accruing to government and the country in general in servicing the debt. So these are hidden costs of government borrowings, although hidden should be in quotation marks, because with some sleuthing and investigation, all this will actually come out. So these are the additional costs entailed that that are not so well known to the general public, especially with respect to foreign loans or what is euphemistically called official development assistance. The first of these additional costs are the so-called commitment fees that are charged to the government on the undrawn amounts of the loan. Commitment fees are a consequence of delays in the implementation of ODA projects and reflect the inefficiency and low absorptive capacity of government implementing agencies. Cost of financing, however, is charged to recipient government regardless of the status of project implementation. Those that charge commitment fees are the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, Germany, Italy, Finland, Austria, and China. Front-end fees, on the other hand, are one-time charges on the committed loan amount and can range from 0.25% to 0.75%. I forgot to mention that for commitment fees, this would range from 0.15% to 0.75%. As for front-end fees, in addition, the World Bank charges an additional front-end fee of 0.75% if the full amount is not disbursed within 3 years of the project. The ADB, JICA, and Sweden also charge a front-end fee. Number 3 are service charges or management fees that are also added to the country's debt service payments, with Japan, Korea, Kuwait, and China imposing such add-ons. Prepayment charges are based on the cost of unwinding any outstanding interest or currency conversions, plus any transaction fees applicable to amounts that were previously converted. The World Bank also charges a renewal fee of 0.5% of the undisbursed balance. Now, number 4, this is a major additional cost of foreign borrowings. And this is the requirement that the borrowing country should have local counterpart funds. So these are project expenditures that are financed by the borrowing country and will apply to both loans and grants. While counterpart funds can be both monetary and non-monetary, it is only the monetary component that is calculated in relation to the ODA disbursement. Next, problems in project implementation results in cost overruns that add additional costs beyond the approved project cost. For 2020, for example, 6 Philippine ODA projects incurred cost overruns that added to the debt burden, which was 17.4% of the original project cost. Next, for large infrastructure projects, a common issue is the right-of-way and land acquisition costs that are mainly paid to private landowners. The government is obligated to pay for these costs based on the market value of the land, thus driving costs higher. A related issue is the relocation costs entailed for communities that would be displaced by large infrastructure projects. While government does not disclose the amounts paid for right-of-way, land acquisition, and relocation costs, it is safe to assume that these run into tens of billions of pesos per year. Next, public debt liabilities are also magnified when government assumes ODA debts contracted by either government-owned or controlled corporations, financial institutions, or the private sector. Under the public-private partnership or the build, operate, transfer schemes, government issues a sovereign guarantee where it promises to assume liabilities incurred by loan defaulting private sector partners. And this defaulting actually takes place quite often. These guarantees become contingent liabilities and part of the public sector deficit. The obligated amounts involved are actually significant.
Dr. Ed, can we
Finally,
start?
there is the long pervasive elephant in the room, tied aid. This refers to loans and grants which are offered on the condition that it be used to procure goods and services from the provider of aid. The OECD, which advocates for the untying of aid, estimates that tied aid can increase the cost of foreign-funded projects by as much as 15% to 30%. In a previous study, for example, I discovered that for Japanese tied loans, prices of goods were over 20% higher than the lowest available international prices and reduced aid value by an average of 10 to 15%. Okay, the Philippine government has been boasting that almost 70% of public outstanding debt has now been sourced by domestic borrowings. And this is supposed to be good news. But there are downsides to this. Of course, there are advantages in terms of currency stability, so there's no currency mismatch, and the government can control monetary policy. However, if the government borrows heavily from the domestic market, it can crowd out investments for the local economy, and also in terms of government expenditures for social services. Domestic borrowings also command higher interest rates. And of course, the local economy has a limited pool of funds. And lastly, borrowing costs and availability of funds depend on local economic conditions, which may not always be favorable for the borrowing government. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ed Tadem, for the very substantive sharing. Again, I remind, please feel free to put your comments and questions that you want our speakers to respond to. Dr. Tadem is the last of our first panel of speakers, and we have another panel of reactors coming up. But before that, perhaps just to break the monotony and think of any questions that you might want, we'll have a 2-minute intermission. We will show you a video of a recent global day of action for debt justice. This is in time for the 2024 spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank held in April of this year. Ira, can you please start it?
also say that we are in a debt and climate crisis. This is not only a crisis of the last 2 years or the crisis of the last decade. This is a crisis of decades, and this is the colonial legacy that we are suffering today. So what we need now are more actions like this. Bigger, bolder actions. Because the backlash is really strong. When we are strong, they also push back very hard. So we face a lot of challenges. Remaking a world is not an easy thing to do. But it's the only thing, it's the necessary thing to do for our survival and our future.
Thank you very much for that sharing from my colleagues at the Justice team of the EPMDD. So as I mentioned earlier, we are still have another set of panel of reactors. before we proceed with our open forum. So I'd like to call on the first of our two panel of reactors. He's the General Secretary of Pakistan Kisan Rabitan Committee and also a member of the APMDD. May I please yield the floor to Farooq Tariq.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I see several friends here, very senior activist of the debt movement, cancel debt movement. And that's really good that APMDD has organized this webinar at this time. And the title is very good, Debt and Destruction, because we are in the trap of debt, and that has destructed Pakistan economy, Pakistan people, and also it has destroyed the social life in Pakistan. There is an absolute poverty and there is an absolute price hike because of the conditionalities of IMF and World Bank, which the present government has implemented forcefully, particularly after the recent budget in June this year. Now, I would like to take up first some background about IMF agreements with Pakistan, and then the impact of those on the economy and also on the social sector. Now, this is 23rd time that Pakistan has come in agreement with IMF. Pakistan joined IMF in July 1950, so it's almost 74 years that Pakistan is member of IMF, and the same day they joined World Bank as well. And the first program with the IMF started in 58, and the latest is just now $7 billion, which government is now trying to receive the latest one. And the second last was in 2019 for also around $7 billion. Now, this and the largest program of IMF was during 2008 with Pakistan People's Party time. That was $7.6 billion US. And that time they forced the government to go for energy sector reforms. So what they forced them to go with the private firms to open and to produce energy by so-called independent power producers, IPPs. And first IPPs came during PPP period in 1994. And these IPPs have now become the largest burden on the energy sector at this time. And these are all mostly privatized, also by Chinese. And the agreements are very unfair with these independent power producers. They are using fossil fuel, they are using oil, gas, and LPG and coal. And they are responsible for the most pollution which is causing at this time in Pakistan. But the agreements are very unfair because they have an agreement with the government. Even if they don't produce electricity, they will charge the government. So at this time, there's a big campaign in Pakistan against the IPPs by many activists, including the traders and so on. And they're saying, why you're paying them when they're not producing anything? And there are several who are not producing a single unit of electricity, but they have been paid fully. So this is the IMF conditionality that was started in 1994, and till today that is going on. Total debt of Pakistan at this time is $131 billion. Out of this, $79 billion are from China. And government best effort at this time is to ask the Chinese government and the private bank of China to defer the repayment of the debt. And they're doing that sometime, and now they are also trying to negotiate to defer for the next 5 years. So Chinese bank and Chinese government is not putting that sort of pressure. that IMF is putting conditionalities, but China is very clever. They say, we don't need your, we don't want to push you for conditionalities. Give us some assets. So Gwadar port is been taken over by China at this time. Same is the case in Sri Lanka, where they have taken over several assets, and so is the case with others. So they don't go to push government to impose more taxes, introduce new indirect taxations and so on, but they say no, give us some assets, and that's how the Chinese are working. Now, IMF has mainly 4 conditionalities on Pakistan, which has been forced on them. One is extend your tax base. Now, they have tried 9 million new tax people, but mainly salary class. They're not taxing the rich, they're taxing the ordinary people, and that is through indirect taxation. And general sales tax in Pakistan is the highest in South Asia, that is 18%. We have 14% in Nepal, 13% in Bangladesh, and India is 18%, but is trying to reduce that. Pakistan is trying to increase that level as well. So tax base extension is their major sort of push. And now at this budget in June, over $13 billion new taxes has been imposed. 3,800 billion rupees, which is $13 billion new taxation on the people. And the result is an absolute price hike, very high electricity rates. I was in a demonstration last week. A textile worker from Faisalabad, a woman, she said, my wage is 22,000 rupees and my electricity bill is 23,000 rupees. And this is the case for most of the working class, that they're paying almost their whole wages in electricity bills. And that is only done in the recent time. And the second conditionality is energy sector reforms. I've spoken about it. Third is that price hike should be linked to international market rates. So they want all the Pakistani prices linked to the international market. And lastly, which is very important, privatization. Sell everything, whatever you have. Now, government has recently announced the sale of 24 government institutions, including the PIA and so on. And World Bank has given to Pakistan, they say that they will give around $8 billion in next 5 years. And Pakistan has just paid over $3 billion in interest rates to IMF at this time. So you see, there was a disaster in 22, a climate disaster. There was earlier the COVID disaster. And after the climate disaster, most of the institutions, including IMF and World Bank, were very sympathetic in words. But the reality was that they got more repayment of the loans than the previous years. And Pakistan has not received what it should have received, as has been promised by several rich countries. And what we say, we don't need new loans, just pay us the reparations. Just pay us the loss and damage. What you have to pay, because Pakistan is not responsible for international climate disaster, it's the industrialized countries. And 75 years of IMF and World Bank in Pakistan has resulted no growth of economy. At this time, the growth is less than 1% in Pakistan. And the poverty is never increased. There are almost 20 million new poor in Pakistan. And that's the result of these loans. So per capita income is also shrinking. So I can tell you some of the impacts. For instance, at this time, there are 26 million children of the school going age, which are out of schools, which is almost 10% of the global children who are not in the schools. And we have also, Pakistan has only 3% of the total global population. And also, the the budget is on education, which was 2.3 in 2019, has decreased now to 1.7% only of the national budget. So you see, social sector has been forced to reduce, and they are paying more, mainly the repayment of the loans and also on the military. And 33% of Pakistan population have diabetes, and Pakistan rank in health wise 124 position out of 169 countries. And hepatitis B and C, 15 million people are impacted. Unsafe water everywhere. And we see most of the deaths are because of the dirty water we are forced to drink. And Pakistan also ranked first in Asia in road accident, because there is no traffic sort of education by the government. And 60 million people live under poverty. So Pakistan at this time is under the total control of IMF and World Bank conditionalities, and the result is more poverty, more destruction of people's life, and more price hike. So we are demanding the abolishment of these institutions. We are demanding reparations. We are demanding the government don't pay the foreign debt, just suspend it, the payment, and pay to the people who have suffered from the climate disaster and who are also now victim of the electricity prices. We're also demanding solar power to ordinary people. Now, what has happened, because the electricity bills have gone very high, so most of the middle class and upper class have now solar system, and most of the poor class has no solar system. And because of the capacity payment to the independent power producer, now when there will be less electricity consumed, more pressure will be on the ordinary people in future. So we say give solar power free to ordinary people rather than just giving some concessions to the rich. And Pakistani rich are bloody rich, and Pakistani poor are bloody poor. So we are fighting against all these injustices and exploitation of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Farouk. And without further ado, I would like to yield the floor to the next and last in our panel of reactors. She is the executive director of AXI for Gender, Social, and Ecological Justice based in Indonesia, Titi Soentoro. Titi.
Hi, thank you, Alvik, and thank you, FPMDD, for giving me the opportunity to react to all what already presented. What I can say, we see all the realities. We see the realities of women, as Misan told us, the reality in India, in Pakistan, and so on, and also how difficult the government has to deal with the debt, as Ed informed us, as Farouk informed us. So the question is, do we need to continue this? We need to understand that IMF and World Bank is not a charitable bank. It is one of the tools from the global capitalistic colonial powers that continue their exploitation and imperialism through a modern tools, which is investment and debt, and all the technical assistance or whatever policy they provide for us. So we need to really know that they are a tool for the Western country, the US, the European, and so on. They are the one behind those institutions, because it's continued their powers, just like that. Through the World Bank and IMF, they can continue sell their products. They can continue take our products for cheaper price, things like that. And, and then right now they give us candies, like, if you borrow and borrow, you can get modernity, you can get high building infrastructure, fast and faster trade, things like that. But the cost of those, we already heard from, not only from our colleagues here, but everywhere. So the ideology, the liberal ideology of the capitalism, and then the neoliberal imposed because the financial crisis is continued, and as Euclid told us, it's internalized in our governments and our intellectual or academics. Everyone believes that growth is the only method to achieve welfare of the people. But the economic growth paradigm, 80 years proven it's wrong. Because right now, that is what we are dealing with. So the question is, this is the realities. Do we want to deal with that? Do we want to reform the IFI, trying to make them fair? Or we need to think other option. We need to envision what kind of development we want. What is our vision of growth, of the welfare and so on. So I think it is important. So I don't believe that the World Bank, IMF will pardon the debt of trillions of US dollars from the Indonesian governments. They will say they will help, but we see what kind of measure they will impose. So the question is reform, or I like what Farouk just said, abolishment of those institutions. So how to do abolishment? For me, so our country, our government should out of the membership of the World Bank and IMF. Without us, the developing country members, they don't have the reason to exist. I already suggest this, but people laugh at me by saying, because the internalization of growth, economic growth, is really intact and strong in our mind. We have to get rid of that. So for me, if we want to really out from this situation, this difficult situation, and we see all the suffering of people, we need to have a measure. We have to have a call, country out from the World Bank and IMF. Don't give them a reason to exist for them. That is my short call. Thank you, Alvin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Titi. And thank you to all our panel of speakers and reactors for all their sharing and reflection. I think we will still have time later in the open forum if you want to stress on some other points that you would have wanted to expound on and wasn't able to during the time of your presentation. But right now, I would like to acknowledge that we have 58 participants all in all, a good number of attendees for these webinars. Perhaps for posterity's sake, let's have a photo op first before jumping into the Q&A and open forum. May I ask my colleague, Ira, to give the instructions for the photo op, please? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. For the photo op, we aim to deliver our message. We want you to pose or to cross your arms like this. Yes, like that. So we'll just wait for our other colleagues to open their cameras and then we will start our photo op. Okay, let's. Okay. Let's just wait for a while. Okay. On the count of 3, I will take the photo, okay? 1, 2, 3. Another one. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Another one for the next slide. 1, 2, 3. And last time. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ira. Okay, so now we are into our open forum. Anyone who wants to share their reactions, questions to any of our speakers or all of our speakers and reactors, just raise your hand. You can use the raise hand button in Zoom. Professor Ahmad?
Yes.
Please.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Yes. May I speak? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you fine. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Dear, one of my observation with the question is that while most of the countries are getting loans from IMF and the World Bank, but the political elites and there are some, we can frankly say, corrupt mafias who or indulge in such bad practices and they don't utilize that money for the production of wealth. You know, even United States, Russia, China, almost all developed countries are also getting a lot of loans. But the point is that they must utilize that money for the generation of more wealth. So the point is that why not the people who are getting loans are not utilizing that money for the generation of their wealth? And most of the time we see that the loan money is utilized in some corrupt malpractices. So that is why the problems go on escalating. And then we say or we abuse that these world organizations are creating fuss for us. They are exploiters and cheaters like that. But the main point again is that when you are lending money, sorry, we are borrowing money, so that must have been utilized for the production of better wealth. For example, if you just open a shop and you get the loan, you must utilize that money for the better production of the more wealth. So this is the problem. This is my perception. So who can answer this question?
Thank you. Maybe we'll entertain a few other questions before we throw back to our speakers for their reactions. May I call on Safdar, who's raising his hand? His or her hand, sorry. Safdar?
Hello, sir. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. You can ask your question now.
First of all, it's a pleasure for me to be the part of this great discussion. My question is very simple regarding death trap, as discussed earlier our participants. I just want to highlight our ground situation at Pakistan, as Farooq Tariq has already mentioned it. Around or more than 26 million children are out of schools, and they are not even working in a skill place to learn or to earn their livelihood in future. My question is, our governments now and before taking death on the name of these innocent children, and they are not getting benefit even now. What is their sin? Just because they are born in Pakistan? And second part is my question, what is the way forward for us in a country where we cannot raise our voice? If we raise our voice, we are declared terrorist, digital terrorist, or even anything can be alleged to us just to stop our voice. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And I'd like to add, there's a question much earlier posted in our chat box also from Denise Fontanilla of the Parliamentarians for a Fossil-Free Future, a network of 800 members of parliament across 95 countries. The question is, the World Bank is the trustee and potential host of the Loss and Damage Fund. Could any of our speakers talk about whether or not it continues to lend to the fossil fuel industry, and what are the implications if so? So that would be the third question. Perhaps we can, before we proceed with other questions, any of our speakers would like to already respond?
Yokling here, maybe I just posted a Friends of the Earth excellent report in the chat in answer to the question of the World Bank lending. So a lot of it, for example, a lot of money has gone out, and you see in this report through the private sector arm of the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and it's done sometimes not directly. This was done in the name of trade finance, but then inevitably goes to oil and gas. But the US also had voted in, I think in 2023, voted to support nearly $400 million US for direct fossil fuel financing at the World Bank Group. So, you can see actually those working in climate justice and energy transition that the developed countries have in the last 5 years, especially since the Ukraine war, increased fossil fuel exploitation domestically as well as supported in financial terms. Yeah, that's that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers would like to respond to the first three questions and comments from Professor Ahmad, Safdor, and Denise? Okay. If not for now, maybe we can Titi, yes.
So regarding Denise's question, the World Bank is the trustee, but the decision makers are the board members of the Loss and Damage Fund. They are the one that determine which project is actually approved. But the question is whether the World Bank will still continue, because the question is in different, you ask the World Bank as the trustee, they don't have actually on the paper should not have a power to decide. But World Bank as a World Bank, it's their decision to continue support the fossil fuel industries, although there are a lot of, resistance or demand for not doing that. I think that's it. And the host, Philippines, is the host of Loss and Damage Fund. A big work, Denise.
Yeah, the board,
challenge is going
yeah,
back to
the board is hosted by the Philippines, means the board will meet in the Philippines, and that's a governance issue. But totally, what Titi says is correct. You see, they are the trustee, but we also seen the World Bank as trustees in other issues on environmental financing, because it's a different governance from the Environmental Sustainable Development Treaties. In effect, they then have a lot of say, right? You can just give guidance and then they don't. The other thing, of course, is capitalization of these funds. As you've seen, every climate fund has been understaffed, staffed or funds. So you may have the fund there, it's controlled indirectly in some ways by the bank, but you don't have money going in. Whereas there's funds going to the World Bank's other kind of channels controlled by the World Bank. And a lot of these funding in the name of energy transition and climate financing is one focus on mitigation. They don't really look at where we need. And in Asia, adaptation is a huge cost. And we're having to finance that. I mean, Pakistan, we talked about that. We are very, very vulnerable in this region as not just the small islands. We have huge population. We have the biggest population in this region in Asia. So when you talk about vulnerability to climate impacts and adaptation that's needed, and loss and damage that's permanent, we are really on top, actually, in terms of impact. But you see that a lot of the public money that is available is more and more now directed to de-risk. In other words, public funds is used to guarantee private money to reduce the risk so that they will invest in all these green, projects, whatever. So we find that I think a lot of us are fighting against that, right? Many people here and outside. So I think that's something. This is what we were calling the mission creep of the bank, yeah, into getting whatever is left of public financing and then forcing us to take private money, which is not interested in taking risk. I just want to quickly raise the issue that for us in Asia, I think a number of other panelists in the chat talked about how, we are having huge unemployment, huge debt. At the same time, we have signed on to many trade and economic agreements where we are actually we are deindustrializing, so we actually don't have employment, we don't have sustained domestic strength and strong enterprises, which means that our domestic revenue is just going down, 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 down. We have huge import surges in most of our Asian countries because we have reduced tariffs of goods to zero. This is part of the trade agreements. We are paying huge amounts in royalties on intellectual property, on technology, on medicines, and increasingly on seeds. So I think these are all the different pieces we need to look at together because they all collectively drain us of our resources that is needed for really true development and social protection. And that's a challenge for us in terms of our mobilizing. I agree with you, Titi. I think this thing about reforming and all that, it's not going to work. How do we attack the financial architecture of the bank? And now there are many new players, not just the bank and the IMF anymore, right? You have all these equity funds, you have all the intermediaries, a lot of private creditors, and a lot of intermediaries in carbon offsets and carbon trading and biodiversity credits and offsets, all those false solutions. They are conservation groups that have subsidiary companies doing blue bonds and green bonds. So we have a lot of new players which are for us in advocacy. Many of them are supposed to be in the NGO community. So I think it really is a challenge for us to rethink the players, the landscape, and how we have to mobilize a lot at the national level and really work together as a region. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to
say something.
Farouk, yes. Sorry.
Okay, before Ehsanul speak or take up a question, I like to congratulate the youth movement of Bangladesh, which has overthrown one of the dictators who has been in power for 16 years. And I hope that they will also deal with the military, which is now trying to take over and trying to run the government. And students are very clear on the issue that we don't want dictatorship. We want a transitional government to go for just elections. And So that is a solution which most of our countries need, what Bangladesh youth has done at present time. But I will just like to say a few sentences about Dr. Gulzar and Safdar's question. Dr. Gulzar is class fellow of mine from University of Punjab, and we have been together for a few years. His question is why they are not producing the wealth. Yes, doctor, they are producing the wealth, but not for us, but for themselves. And there's a lot of money laundering. They have billions of dollars in their bank accounts in Switzerland and Dubai. Even in Dubai, $15 billion US property is owned by Pakistani capitalist class. And Pakistani capitalist class has been offered state concessions to the extent of 14 billion in 2021 alone. And so no concession for the working class, no remedies for the problem of the people, but the rich are becoming much more richer because they control the parliament, they control the government, is the feudal and the capitalist class alliance alongside with IMF and World Bank. And also they are going along and trying to play together with China and America, US imperialism, trying to, in geopolitics, they're trying to please the both, which will not go very far. As the Prime Minister said the other day, that we are on the way, as China has told us to do, but next day they contradicted. No, we are also very good friend of America. So that sort of suggestions, because these two institutions are controlled by Americans, and the Chinese also has to take 79 billion US dollar, and CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, has already spent over $40 billion in Pakistan infrastructure. But this wealth which has been spent in Pakistan has nothing to do with elimination or eradication of poverty. It has used for building infrastructure for the rich and for China itself, who want to have very cheap transportation of their goods through Pakistan. So we have to have a very independent position. We're not supporting Chinese sort of way of capitalism or American way of capitalism. We need an end of capitalism, and we need a different alternative system in Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Farouk. Asanul, please share your thoughts and question. Asanul, you're on mute.
Thank you, Alvik. Thank you very much, all. Actually, I am shutting down my video because still the internet connection is a bit poor. So maybe you can hardly get my speech, or sometimes I also getting some disturbance while I listening your speech. However, thank you, Farooq bhai, assalamu alaikum, for showing your solidarity. And are you hearing me, Alvik?
Hearing you very well.
Okay, okay. So you know that everybody knows, so I don't want to repeat the same thing that about the student movement. We just said that after getting the liberation war in 1971, we got another freedom in 2024. So this is only for the it made come true only for the student movement, not by any political politics. So students movement is a power. So the country, other politicians, and the whole world seen this. Though the information is not in the news media, that the information that is came, actually it is not true. It is more than more. Suppose still it is saying that altogether 500, 600 has death, but it is more than 2,000. So they goomed most of the bodies. So You know that yesterday Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has resigned. So we, along with my family, went to see the situation, the outburst of the joys of the people and the student. We went to the Gan Bhavan. Gan Bhavan is the place where the Prime Minister's official residence nearby the National Parliament. So someone is saying that the bad smell has been coming from the ground, and someone is saying that the students and that they have boomed and buried in there inside the place. So the bad scent also coming from there. So nobody knows how they did this massacre. However, we are sorry for this, and thank you, the comrades all who stand beside the country and the students. So let's see now the government. So far I heard that Dr. Mohammad Yunus, Professor Yunus is coming. He is taking the lead of the coalition government. Army is not taking, but today, maybe today, maximum by tomorrow, they will form the government. So however, thank you very much. Please pray, keep us in your prayers for the developing of the country. So let's come to the point. Actually, the Farouk's Bhai, what they said, actually the same scenario in the Bangladesh. Where at first I will say that it needs a strong political will, that how the choice of the government and how they want to deal it. So I would say that the rest government, that the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's government, they actually they did not have any political strong political will, rather than give emphasis to how to build the money for their own. I mean, the corruption and corruptions, plenty of corruption. So I can't say what is the corruption they have made, and the money laundered or capital fight they have made for their own selves. The bank looting, the common problem, they are not giving emphasis on the public service issues, especially education, health, other electricity, energy, sanitation, water, rather than giving emphasis on the mega structure projects like for the multipurpose bridge, metro rail, expressway, flyover, blah, blah, blah. But so that this is the easy way to how they create the black money. You know that we had about $22 billion of new budget deficit, and government every year that depends on the domestic and foreign loan or debts. So for this corruption, the government, our Bangladesh bank reserves drastically fall down, which was just 1 year ago, it was $50 billion. Now it is almost in single digit. I can say someone saying that $8-9 billion or 10, maximum 10 or $11 billion. So you know that what is the situation is now. And for this season, government has requested IMF to lend on $4.5 billion to just to increase the reserve, and that's why government IMF has given some conditions that is very harmful for our economy, for our other services. The major conditions were actually reducing subsidies and increasing the price of the electricity, hydroelectricity, oil and gas, increasing rate and scope of taxes, tax bases, especially VAT as indirect tax, increase personal tax from 20% to 30%, and already they did it. Reduce corporate tax from 25 to 20%, reduce import duty. Matter of fact, that government is working on that path. Government totally agreed with these conditions, and that's why our electricity price has increased.
Asanul, can you wrap up so that we can also go to the others who would like to?
Yeah, I am just almost finished.
In the interest of time, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm just almost finished. So this is our main problem, the inflation problem for the reserve fall down. So there's and so. So I think that we are actually are blocking with the loan the different conditionalities of IMF, and this is our big challenge how to overcome this. Though we are in the QTBD Bakos Foundation, we are doing different campaigns and giving our demands and our request to the government and the policy makers so that they give emphasis to arrest the illicit financial flows, arrest the black economy, so that depends on loan in internal and external, it can be reduced. So our debt movement it is still continuing, and we'll do more in future. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's good to hear. Thank you, Asanul. Sorry to cut you, but we have other questions. I'll just go to the chat box just to quickly go through. Some are actually been answered by some of our speakers or replied by other participants. Rovic Obanil of Freedom from Debt Coalition has asked about the World Bank's evolution roadmap. What are their thoughts? I see Yokling has replied to that. If the other speakers would like to, you can also please do so. Val Vibal from the Philippines, sa aniban ng mga manggagawa sa agrikultura or AMA. We have been calling for a shutdown of IMF and World Bank for several decades. Are there new strategies to realize this call, or its shutdown will be done after capitalism have been changed? So that's his question. Titi has replied to that, and we can ask other speakers who would like to reply to that as well. And then we have Flora Santos. She said in the chat box, we all know that IMF, the World Bank loans, is not for our good, but instead make us poorer. I like the suggestion that we should not access these banks. But our problem, our governments keep on borrowing. As CSO citizens, what should be our best action so that governments stop borrowing from these exploitative banks? So that's from Flora Santos of Oryang Women's Movement in the Philippines. Sandra also has indicated in the comment, IMF has imposed on Kenya under loan agreement for a 38-month program. Is sharing as some of you might know what's happening in Kenya right now with the unrest because of some fiscal and tax policies that has proven to be met with a lot of opposition from groups. Okay, so are there any speakers or reactors who would like? Oh, May.
Just to flag also an earlier question by Nazareth of Freedom from Debt Coalition about examples of illegitimate debts. These are debts that we know are tainted with corruption or fraudulence and destroy the environment or violated human rights, for which we call for immediate and unconditional cancellation. So examples from other countries, and also feedback from Sandra Misiribi on how women are impacted and bear the private because of the public debt burden and inability to adequately provide social services, the connection with household debt, and how women are targeted for household debts by microfinance entities that already include corporations today. Thank you.
Thank you, May. Miss An?
Yeah, thank you very much. And just to add maybe a few points of reflection. Yeah, I think there was one question on how do we make sure that those money that we borrow from IMF or World Bank is actually used to reproduce the wealth, but with the conditionalities and then the main political ideology behind the IMF and World Bank, the system is not made to reproduce the wealth nor redistribute the wealth, right? And then it's just not possible. And that's why the call is not to reform, but to dismantle or abolish the current system. But then And it did accumulate wealth to the very small population in the global north and also in our own country with the elites and feudal lords. But what it did really was to really maximize the inequalities, right, between men and women, between rich and poor, and between the countries. I think that's why. But when it comes to how do we do it and what do we do it is actually the ongoing question also to us as APWLD. And I think that we have already some examples of fighting it back, including making a disruption. I want to share a couple of examples where the women's groups, including APWLD and also other social justice movements, had gone for the global women's strike, withdrawing our labor, really addressing the gender pay gap, unpaid, unrecognized care labor of women in all across the society. So we stop working and see what it means to society. I also understand the migrants movements have actually stopped sending the remittance to the country to really hit the financial flow. And I think making those disruptions will give us some idea what it might look like if we actually join our forces at one moment in time. And I go to the point that Farouk mentioned, it was also raised in one of our convening, where also Mayor was there, is to really demand our governments to stop paying debt. And imagine on one day at one time, all the governments who owe whatever money which we don't owe to IMF and World Bank, stop paying and see what it happens. And as Titi mentioned, and again, get out of the IMF and World Bank, right? But then for that, I think what is really direly needed is for us, I mean, diverse peoples, movements, and civil society to have a political unity, right? And how do we build a political unity that chart out the step-by-steps to actually dismantle the IMF and World Bank? And I think, as Yoklin mentioned, as much as our governments or states have internalized or neoliberal capitalist policies or colonialism, many of our members talked about how we actually have our mind colonized. And we really have to make an effort to decolonize this mind that we have, and also to actually imagine what the future might look like. In one of the meetings, when a member said, actually, there was no poverty in Mongolia before the market system, some of us really grappled, what do you mean that there was no poverty, right? And it really shrunk our capacity to imagine what the society should look like, or actually it looked like before this colonialism happened, for instance, right? So there are many, many things, actually a lot of work for us to do, which is challenging because the other side has a very clear one object, to make profit, while we have many demands because we are diverse people's movements, and we also have to acknowledge that there are different power within our movements, not to mention the historically marginalized group like women. When there is a social conversation to accept or not accept the IMF conditionalities, most of the time, women are not at the table to discuss the policy directions. It includes in the labor movement and labor policy, for instance. So I think there are things that we can chart out what are the small, maybe disruptions the movements were able to achieve, but actually to a lot of efforts to imagine what the new future can look like based on what our communities already have and have believing and pushing for, instead of the neo-colonial market system that we are enforced to live.
Thank you, Ms. On. If there are, I don't see any hands anymore and no new questions. Oh, Hillary Jo. And then Anisha.
Thank you so much. And good day, everyone. Hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I just wanted to also come in with a situation here we have in Zimbabwe. After the land reform, Zimbabwe was targeted with sanctions, and it's now almost about 20 years now under sanctions. And one of the conditions that we are being subjected to, which our government has agreed to do for the removal of sanctions, is to pay over 3 billion, almost 4 billion United States dollars to the former holders, the former white farmers who were owning the land before the land reform. So for us, it is something which we see that it is one of those issues which are discussing here, issues to do with colonial debt, because originally during the independence conference in 1980, in the late 70s, it was agreed that the colonial government, which is the British government, was going to pay those farmers who are going to be displaced by land resettlement. And unfortunately, during the Thatcher government, Clay Short actually declared that they were not going to pay colonial debts, as they were saying they said themselves by then, that is in the mid-80s. So now we have a situation whereby the ordinary people, the suffering people of Zimbabwe, are now being forced now to also pay those very same people who benefited from the same land for over 100 years in their individual and personal capacities. So these are some of those issues which we are seeing, that there are a lot of synergies within the Global South system, within the Global South network, which we face commonly from the same Bretton Woods Institute. This is the World Bank and the IMF. They are doing almost the same things in different regions of the world and differently, but having the same agenda and the same maybe outcome they are looking at. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm looking for the other hand
That
earlier.
was me, Anusha.
Anusha.
Hi.
Hello, Anusha.
Hi. Thank you. So I just wanted to add a reflection and question of, particularly when it comes to when we're talking about the reform versus abolish issue, right? And at some point, I mean, the question really that's coming up is, with the level of internalization that we're looking at of certain systems and ways of functioning, the point being that dismantling of two financial institutions in particular may not, I don't know if that really remains the answer 80 years hence, because also the issue of a vacuum, because the practices exist, the practices have been internalized and the practices have spread. And that would sort of refer to a lot of the other MDBs. And at some point also picking up on what the other thing that's being said, that there is still loans. The issue of the controls by loans, even if from other entities, that would come up, and the trade-offs between, for example, land and loans that's happening in the case of that's happened in Sri Lanka, that's happened in Pakistan, is also a dangerous precedent that, so at some point, the point that I'm making, and also I think looking at in a little more also in line with what Misun just said, and there was others that came up, is that there is the question perhaps for a larger alternative in any case more than that, because the interlinked institutions and the trade-off and the balancing that's happening also is something that would need to be looked at in terms of a larger picture. And and at some, I think maybe looking in the direction that came up recently also, what communities already have and what are the alternatives that we could be looking and building up from. So, I mean, that's just a reflection and adding to the discussion here. And if there's any other thoughts on it, that would be good. Thank you.
Thank you, Anusha. And if I may also add on the Anusha's first point on abolition versus reform, I think a couple of our speakers also mentioned about the upcoming UN Financing for Development 4 conference. And it's also something to reflect to what extent or if the UNFFD process can actually be used to push for the eventual pushing for the eventual lessening or the influence and the dominance of the World Bank and IMF in terms of the centrality in making global rules with regards to not just debt but finance in general. That's something that also to be reflected on. Yes, others may
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you for this very wonderful participation from various regions. I just wanted to highlight our discourse, which I think many of us share here, on illegitimate debts. which was and continues to be a revolutionary concept because we're standing debt on its head. Debt supposedly as bound by legal contracts, but which we are saying as many of these debts are illegitimate. They did not consult with us, and they are borrowings in our name. They also destroyed a lot of the environment, and many of these we continue to pay. So we have examples from India, but like the Tata Mundra plant, and also in Indonesia, there's many examples of illegitimate debts. So the question earlier in this chat is, as Ms. Sun mentioned, really make a stand advocating with our own governments, as well as in the global, but with our own governments to say, if our rights are being compromised, if there's no budget for health services, as what happened in COVID, because there's a very low investment in the public health sector, then the people's welfare, the people's rights should be prioritized, and we should press for the repudiation, the rejection of these debts, and a period perhaps from suspension to outright cancellation of debts that are shown to be illegitimate and must be immediately and unconditionally canceled. Thank you.
Thank you, May. Perhaps I'm not seeing any new hands now. I would like to ask if any of the speakers would have a last say before we go to the closing part of this webinar. Yes, Yokling.
Yeah, maybe a couple of reflections. Thank you so much. I think it's been it's rich, it's also familiar ground. And I think one of the things we have to watch against is to think that we need to have something new, right? I think is fighting the fight, because we've done the analysis. It's 80 years of having the affirmation of the structural analysis and the fights, and a lot of lessons we've all learned over the decades. So a couple of reflections I would say. The two things. One is, we can call for abolishing. It's not going to happen overnight. We know that. The two things. One is that there is the constant seeking of legitimacy by these institutions, right? It's not just the World Bank and IMF, it's all the MDBs. So we have to push back on their wanting to take on, the bank and the IMF came up with gender policies, which are awful. And I think all the groups, feminist groups, human rights groups, we all banded together and we actually pushed it back and we called it out. I think calling out has to continue to be done. The way they are trying to green and climate friendly, so I think all these new ways of seeking legitimacy for these institutions, we have to call it out and going to push it back. And then I think the debt cancellation and legitimate debt is a very important part of our advocacy, and we need to step it up. In fact, it's gotten worse. I totally agree with May. It's even worse than it has been before. So if you actually listen to some of the heads of states, prime ministers and presidents speaking in the United Nations General Assembly in the last 2 or 3 years, and even the Secretary General, he's calling out. Some of the heads of states are calling out because they are running other countries where it's so desperate that we are talking about. Even some of these politicians. Now, and if they're saying it, they're really desperate, right? And then Guterres is saying, the financial architecture has to change because it was built to be unequal. It was built to have the dominance of a few countries, and now it's corporations as well. So I think we need to pick up there's a national fight. There's also this global fight. And I think we need to have that clarity in our advocacy. So the debt cancellation and legitimate debt, we need to really step it up. Now, a set of new players is around financial risk and stability. I mean, not new, they've been there, but they become more powerful. These are the 3 private rating agencies that when they rate us, and this is why governments and politicians, they do not dare to do things that they should be doing with all the pressures from the ground in a country. Because if you do something even right, look at, was it Ecuador? After 20 years of advocacy, the Ecuador, population went for a referendum and they agreed that they will keep the oil in the ground. What happens in 24 hours after the referendum result came out and they were going to keep the oil in the ground and do no more Amazonian mining? The rating agencies downrated Ecuador and the financial risk increased, which means your cost of borrowing and everything increases in 24 hours. So you get punished for doing the right thing. right? So this calling out of these rating agencies is something that we have not done collectively enough, because why should three private companies decide on our financial risk? Now, look at what the African Union has done recently. Whether it's going to work or not depends on how much we are going to give support as civil society. They said that the African Union said that they could support their own rating agency for financial risk using different indicators, right? So I think these are the things that we need to look at. And the Financing for Development conference next year, we saw the first one was kind of unusual because of the financial crisis of 2008. So we see the outcome, and the civil society, many people in our different networks and organizations were so involved in that. And we got a document out in the UN on finance and financial architecture that was unimaginable, but it was because of the moment. I remember sitting in one of the events in the UN in New York, where the rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Moody, they were all in a panel and they were grilled by member states, and civil society were there as observers and also putting up our hands. So, but along the way, they have pushed back. They pushed back very effectively, as many people have said today. And so you see every financing for development outcome since then has been a dilution of the first outcome. And I think we have to be very careful, because the next one next year, after all this talk about internalization and all that kind of stuff, may become actually even more diluted. So we do have one opportunity. It's not many weeks left, but let's at least make noise outside, even if we can't influence the document. When we saw the first version and the second version of the Pact of the Future, it's gone backwards, right? And a lot of it is through negotiations. Don't blame the UN Secretariat. It's through negotiations of member states, including our own, because our finance ministries are giving positions. And they do not want to move things from Washington to New York in terms of human rights in the UN. So I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of our national side. And I think we need to keep chipping away so that the system becomes illegitimate. Otherwise, I think so it's a strategy issue as opposed to the political call of saying this institution has no place in the world because they're so destructive. And certainly cancellation of drug, and having, for God's sakes, we've been asking for how many decades, right? An orderly restructuring of debt. We need bankruptcy laws for sovereign debt. So now the tax convention, many of you are involved in that, I think. So let's push, because there's also pushback, but we also have an opportunity. I think these are the pieces. I think you said, how do we organize ourselves? And I think we have a lot more experience, and we've learned some lessons, and we need to sort of look towards that in the next 12 to 14 months. Thank you.
Thank you. And to close our webinar, may I call on the program manager of the Debt Justice Program of APMDD, May Buenaventura. May?
Yeah. So I cannot thank everyone enough for this wonderful seminar, and it's going to generate a lot of knowledge that we will, of course, incorporate in the notes, in resource materials, and in the feedback that came out of the chat, and very rich ideas. So we're all very much aware of the negative impacts of the harms done by the IFIs, but we also need to look at how they are able to shape our economies and societies through the loans and the conditionalities that they deny but continue to this day, the structural adjustment, and really encroaching deep even into shaping our tax systems and imposing more regressive taxes, primarily for the purpose of raising finances to repay the debt. So that is the narrowness of their debt sustainability, that it's limited to capacity to pay. So it's not their issue if there's deep inequalities within countries or very risky, very threatened by climate change, but you must pay. Otherwise, you will be penalized, just as what's happening to Pakistan with the surcharges of the IMF. And we must also not forget who are the real powers behind the IMF and the World Bank, because we know this as the handful of rich countries, the G7, that we're also fighting on other fronts for the refusal to recognize their responsibility for the climate crisis. And the tragic thing, the infuriating thing, is that they continue to push loans as the solution to multiple crises, as the solution to climate even, which has widely recognized as a justice issue. Based on the principle of common but differentiated principles. And I agree with what was mentioned, that we really must erode their legitimacy. At different points that was eroded, but they've come back again. from the Asian financial crisis, and then they've come back again with new lending windows and false solutions that they promote from the G7 countries. So there's two things that we need to do in terms of advocacy and campaigning on the ground for rejection, repudiation, debt audits, really examining what it is they are asking us to pay, and call for repudiation. And at the same time, using all the fronts possible in regional and global arenas. So I will not attempt to bring up all the points raised, but invite you all to join us in the Global Days of Action. And that is our logo that we will hold from October 15 to October 27. October 15 is the date that debt justice movements always mark for the assassination of Tomas Sankara, a really stalwart and inspiring figure in the debt justice movement who was assassinated but continues to inspire us to this day. So we will also be holding an International People's Tribunal from the 25th to the 26th against the IMF in the world and the World Bank, and to demand debt, economic, and climate justice. So write us if you want to know more, and we can add you to the global calls that have happened monthly since last month, since July, and there's others coming up. So thank you very much, and we wish you all the best in our common struggles, and we know that our paths will cross again in the near future as we continue this good fight, this fair and fight for justice and freedom, and for a systemic change that we really need, be able to reform or deeply and profoundly change the international financial architecture. Thank you very much, and good evening from the Philippines.
Both the debt crisis and the climate crisis are now a threat to the very existence of humanity. Many of these issues are very much entrenched in colonial and imperial legacies.
The global world, they need to deliver. Not because we need, not only because we need, but because this is part of reparations for historical harms and injustices that's continuing. They're exploiting our country.
We are shaking the walls or shaking the corridors of power. There's a backlash.
We're working and we're asking to build a big front, calling for debt cancellation, calling for climate justice, and to fight together, because we need to be together.